Okay, we're back, and I wanted to mention here, just as a sort of the wrap up in with the progressive era, was that the decisive role of women in the progressive movement. So the background to that is that the best way to think of societal, gender roles in the before 1900 really was that of what's called separate spheres. So a sphere, being a geometric term for a ball, essentially, but or you could think about it as circles on a Venn diagram. And before, the progressive movement, the increase in education, the increase of women's roles in society and work, those circles and a maybe a Venn diagram would have been next to each other, touching, but still separate. And then over time, with as the you get toward the 20th century and then 20th century progresses, those that sort of Venn diagram, those circles just sort of merge into each other's with only with quite a lot of overlap. And so here, women are trying to push beyond the sphere that they had previously occupied, and or at least increase its scope. Maybe it would be a better way to put it. So the why of this usually centers around urbanization, but also education, or at least the desire for education. Those were a couple of the sort of push factors that brought about this change, but also just the level of concern. A lot of these progressive issues fell within women's sphere of concern, if you want to say, maybe put it that way. And so that's where they got their start in a lot of cases. And one place that it actually became a big deal was in church. There were already a lot of women's groups in churches. Women would meet in churches, and so that was not an unusual thing to occur, and therefore they that church meeting might evolve into something. And so one of the big ones was missionary societies. These were very common in across a number of denominations, especially in the South. Um, but that was the area that women first kind of got their start to be able to, have a real impact. And so a lot of missionary societies would sort of grow into these temperance societies that we've already talked about here with the temperance movement. And it was very critical in this sort of in the early era. I already mentioned temperance in general earlier, and I didn't want to overrun that again, but just want to make sure I cover what we need to cover here. I think that covers most of it. One I wanted to get towards here was, and it links into what we've been talking about with progressivism, is the modern U.S. presidency. We're going to have a series of presidencies that are going to be heavily influenced by progressivism, will be involved in different aspects of progressivism. And so what I want to mention that here is with Theodore Roosevelt, who's going to kind of wrap up the end of the 1800s and will trickle over into the beginning of the 1900s. And so he is an interesting character in that regard. One of the question here, what makes a modern U.S. president? You can think about that for a second and imagine, the various presidencies that you've lived under, and what characterizes a president these days, and maybe you think about, like versus presidencies in the early 1800s. back in the early 1800s, a presidency might not be too worried about the mood of the United States, in their what they're trying to accomplish, or will they be able to accomplish what they want to do. They might not be too worried about dealing with the press or manipulating the press in a certain way to achieve goals. They might not have to, and this is a big one, might not have to have a particularly engaging personality. People worry so much now about image and sound bites and everything that goes into that persona that people see and hear on a near daily basis. And in the early 1800s, you wouldn't have had to think too much about that. There were people who reported on the White House and the comings and goings there, but it wasn't, the president wasn't in the public eye constantly as they are in modern times. And so those are some of the things that change here around the end of the 1800s. And for a lot of people, Theodore Roosevelt tends to be considered the first modern U.S. president. Not completely. He was, raised in the world of, old school, wealth and privilege in the United States and in Europe. He took trips to Europe, and he had visited, wealthy people and even, some royalty there and understood the court system, the old school court system that existed before World War One. He, was part of the old school wealth in the United States that could, pack up and travel for months at a time, and understood that world, very well. But he consciously made the choice to be different than that society. He's known for what was not his term, the strenuous life, pushing his boundaries and integrating himself into the Western United States mindset, and was just an interesting character in that regard. And so he brings, his unique personality brings with it a lot of these unique things about the modern presidency. So we'll get into that here a bit. So Theodore Roosevelt, born in 1858, so just there before the Civil War. In his early life, he was the son of a New York merchant, wealthy, well-to-do father who he married a Georgia socialite. So he had parents who were kind of on both sides of the North-South divide there. He was a cultured youth, like I mentioned, visited Europe, spoke fluent German, and was well-versed in a number of other languages. But his primary challenge as a kid was that he was sickly. That's probably the best term for it. It's hard to say with modern terms exactly what he suffered from. It was a mixture of like severe asthma and some stomach digestive type issues that really debilitated him for a good bit of his young life. And he really did, he was underweight, he had poor eyesight, had trouble with strenuous activity. And so he would be, go for periods, even when they were traveling in Europe, they would have to just kind of stop for a while to let TR, kind of heal up. But once he did, and once he was feeling good, he would throw himself into whatever it is that he was involved in. Often that was really, really long hikes over rough terrain, up mountains. And so it was one of those feast and famine things with his physical activity. But he really did come to love being vigorous. I think it gave him a sense of health. And so he chose, over the course of, his, I would say, about the time somebody would have been in middle school today, his dad told him that, basically, Theodore, you have the mind, but you don't have the body. And you're going to have to without the body, it's hard for the mind to succeed. And so you're going to have to really try to build up your body. And so he actually really took that to heart. His family had enough uh, financial resources to have a sort of like at the time a gym basically put on their back porch of their house in New York. And he built himself up. He would work the machines that they had and, try to be outdoors, physically active, and, built himself up. And once he got to college, he took up boxing. That became one of his big interests, although he, just being smaller at the time, he, couldn't hang with some of the larger boxers, but was known to stick with them as best he could. He was insatiable in his interest in a lot of cases. As a kid, it was birds was one of his biggest interests. He even wrote some early things about birds that got published back then. He would end up writing about 38 books over the course of his life, and he was an insatiable reader, often reading a book a day. He had a photographic memory that he would describe it as if he's trying to remember something that he'd read. It was like the words were flowing across his eyes. So that was a gift that he had there. But he was just known for, boundless energy and effort put into things. He graduated from Harvard. About 2 years later, he was able to make his way into the New York legislature, so he was kind of on the fast track to succeeding in public life, but did suffer a tragedy. His mother and his wife died within 11 hours of each other, and so it was a really difficult period for him. Really changed the course of his life in a lot of ways. He had to kind of get away from this sort of terrible fate that had befallen him, and so he ended up moving west for a while. Ended up leaving an infant daughter with a sister, quit politics, sold the family house, and moved to the Dakota Territory to work in cattle ranch there. He was ranging by day, reading by the campfire at night, and he spent about 2 years living the cowboy life. That was just how he coped with the losses that he dealt with. But continuing that sort of toughness that he had developed. He was at one point teased by some drunken cowboy over the fact that he had glasses, relatively thick spectacles at the time, and ended up knocking him out with a single punch. So the story goes. And there's a number of stories about Roosevelt's time out west for those 2 years. But he will return to New York in 1886, campaigns for mayor, moves into the Civil Service Commissioner position, becomes the New York Police Commissioner. So he's, again, trying to work on a trajectory in public life here. In 1896, he campaigns for McKinley and finds his way into the position of assistant. He becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy, New York Governor, and the get myself ahead. I'm sorry. I was looking at one thing and looking at another and getting confused between them. I have to get two screens here I'm looking at. Sorry. So yeah, in 1896, campaign for McKinley. McKinley wasn't a particular fan, thought of Roosevelt as a bit hot-headed and pugnacious, but ends up relenting, ends up serving in the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, known for his exploits with the group called the Rough Riders. That becomes sort of his public persona in a lot of ways, and is important in him getting into the New York governor position. So let me pause there, and we'll come back and talk a bit more about this.